Welcome to Heartfelt Tales, the channel where stories come alive and emotions transcend the screen. Today, we dive into a narrative that will keep you on the edge of your seat, gripping your attention with every twist and turn. This video is packed with insights, moments of deep reflection, and unexpected revelations that will leave you questioning the very nature of compassion, fate, and human resilience. We've carefully crafted this tale to ensure you don't miss a single detail, so make sure to stay with us until the very end. Trust us, by the time you finish, you'll feel like you've lived through every moment with the characters. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel to join the ever-growing community of those who appreciate the art of storytelling. This is a journey you won't want to miss. The small coastal town of Port Blossom, Maine, was a picture of tranquility, especially during the summer months. Its picturesque streets were lined with charming white cottages and colorful boats bobbing gently in the harbor. The air was crisp and salty, carrying with it the scent of the ocean and the faint hum of distant waves crashing against the shore. The town's cobblestone streets were bustling with locals and tourists alike, but the pace of life remained slow, almost as if the very rhythm of the place had been tuned to match the waves' steady ebb and flow. Port Blossom had long been known for its natural beauty, its vast stretches of rocky coastline, lush forests, and the wildflowers that dotted the meadows like confetti in the breeze. Yet beneath this idyllic exterior, there were whispers of economic difficulties. The fishing industry, once the backbone of the town's economy, had been struggling for years. The once thriving wharves were now quiet, and the fishermen who remained could be seen gathering at the docks, their faces weathered with the weight of 1,000 untold stories. Tourism, the town's new lifeline, brought money to the local businesses, but the seasonal nature of the industry meant that many of the residents struggled during the quieter months. It was in this small town that Barron, the son of a prominent political figure, found himself spending the summer. The Barron family had rented a luxurious oceanfront estate for the season, a grand property that stood in stark contrast to the humble cottages that dotted the shoreline. The estate was perched atop a cliff, offering sweeping views of the Atlantic Ocean. The mansion was a blend of old-world charm and modern luxury, with sprawling gardens, a private dock, and an infinity pool that seemed to melt into the horizon. For Barron, the summer retreat was a chance to escape from the public eye, to spend time away from the constant scrutiny that came with being a member of such a high-profile family. Barron, a teenager of few words, was known for his composed demeanor. He rarely sought attention and preferred to remain a silent observer of the world around him. While other guests at the resort would gather by the pool or indulge in the myriad activities offered, Barron could often be found sitting alone on the edge of the property, gazing out at the vast expanse of ocean. There was something about the sea that seemed to calm him, offering him solace in a way that the bustling resort could not. Though he rarely joined in the lively games and social gatherings, Barron felt at ease in the quiet moments of reflection. He was content to watch the ebb and flow of life around him, the laughter of families enjoying their vacation, the chatter of couples walking hand in hand along the shore, and the distant calls of seagulls soaring overhead. It was a far cry from the chaos of the world he left behind, and for a brief moment, he could forget about the weight of his last name and simply be. As the afternoon sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows over the town, the scene shifted to the harbor, a bustling area that had long been the heart of Port Blossom's community. The salty scent of the sea was stronger here, mingling with the smells of fish and the faint hint of fuel from the boats that lined the docks. The harbor was where the locals gathered, where stories were exchanged, and where the pulse of the town could be felt most strongly. Yet today, the harbor seemed quieter, as if a heavy silence hung in the air, waiting to be broken. Among the people gathered at the harbor was Thomas Evans, a fisherman whose life had once been entwined with the sea. His weathered face, hardened by years of exposure to the elements, told the story of a man who had known both hardship and triumph. His clothes, once sturdy and well-kept, were now worn and frayed, a reflection of his dire circumstances. The deep creases around his eyes spoke of countless sleepless nights, and his once strong hands now shook slightly as he gripped the rusted railing of the dock. Thomas had once owned a small fishing boat, his only means of livelihood. The boat had been his father's before him, passed down through generations of fishermen who had made their living off the waters of Port Blossom. But a series of misfortunes had stripped Thomas of everything he once held dear. His boat had been lost in a storm, and with it, his only source of income. The insurance money he had hoped for never came, and the town's dwindling economy made it impossible for him to find another vessel. He had been left with nothing but his memories and the haunting thought that the sea, which had once given him everything, had now taken it all away. With no home to return to, Thomas had been forced to sleep in public spaces, sometimes in the park, other times in the shadows of the harbor. He survived on the meager coins that passers-by dropped into his cup, but even this small gesture of kindness was becoming increasingly rare. As he stood there, staring out at the water, his thoughts turned inward. The hopelessness that had begun to consume him over the past few months had become an ever-present companion, clouding his every thought. The future seemed uncertain, and the idea of a life without purpose or stability weighed heavily on his soul. He wondered how he had ended up in such a place. How had everything gone wrong so quickly? He had once dreamed of a future where his children would follow in his footsteps, inheriting the family boat and continuing the legacy that had been built over generations. But now, that dream seemed as distant as the horizon before him. He was no longer a man of the sea, he was just another shadow on the docks, a man forgotten by the world. Thomas shuffled through the streets of Port Blossom, his weathered hands gripping an old, tattered hat. He hesitated at each passerby, feeling a sense of discomfort as he approached them to ask for spare change. He had been doing this for weeks, ever since he lost his boat and his livelihood. Yet each time felt like a fresh sting, his pride and desperation battling inside him. Most people hurried past him, eyes averted, pretending they hadn't seen the man standing there in need. Some would glance quickly at him, but no one would stop. The rich, busy tourists barely spared a moment, their faces closed off as if his presence were an inconvenience they would rather ignore. Thomas had grown used to it. His heart, once open to the world, had closed over the years as he had been forced to face the harshness of life. He was just another shadow in the crowd. But today, something was different. As he scanned the faces of the tourists, his gaze landed on a young man sitting by himself on the steps, looking out over the harbor. The boy was tall, with an air of calm that was impossible to miss. He wasn't laughing with friends or chatting like the others. No, this young man's posture spoke of someone who preferred to observe rather than participate. At first, Thomas didn't think much of it. Another rich kid, probably, who would just ignore him like the rest. But there was something in the boy's demeanor, a quiet strength, perhaps, that made Thomas reconsider. It was a feeling, an intuition that tugged at him. What harm could it do to try? He took a deep breath and walked toward the boy. His steps were slow, his heart racing as he approached. Reaching Barron, he stood there for a moment, hesitating, unsure of how to phrase his request. His voice, when he spoke, was rough, carrying the weight of days spent with little food and less hope. "Excuse me, sir," Thomas began, "could you spare a few coins? Just enough to get something warm to eat. A cup of coffee would be nice, maybe a sandwich." Barron didn't immediately respond. Instead, he froze mid-scroll on his phone, his gaze lifting to meet Thomas's. His expression was unreadable, his face calm and composed, as always. Thomas couldn't read him, and that made him nervous. The young man didn't look at him with pity, nor did he look away in disdain. He simply looked at him, studying him in a way that was almost thoughtful. For a moment, Thomas wondered if he had made a mistake in approaching him. Maybe Barron would say no, as everyone else did, maybe with a hint of annoyance or a flick of his wrist to signal dismissal. But instead, Barron asked a question that caught him off guard. "What do you need it for?" he asked, his tone calm but firm, devoid of any judgment. There was no mocking in his voice, no condemnation, just a genuine curiosity. Thomas blinked, taken aback by the question. It wasn't what he had expected, but it wasn't an unwelcome question either. For a moment, he hesitated. This wasn't a conversation he was used to having, and for a moment, he was unsure of how to respond. But then, after a deep breath, he spoke. "I lost my boat in a storm," he said, his voice quieter now, filled with the weariness of days spent in uncertainty. "No insurance. No help from anyone. I've been trying to get back on my feet, but it's hard. Sometimes I can't even find enough for a meal." As he spoke, Barron didn't interrupt. His eyes stayed focused on Thomas, his brow furrowed in thought as he listened intently. It was the first time in ages that someone had really listened to him, without making assumptions or looking at him with disgust. The sincerity in Barron's gaze was unmistakable. Around them, the tourists had begun to notice the conversation. Whispers spread through the crowd, but Barron didn't seem to mind. He kept his focus on Thomas, who felt a strange warmth in his chest despite his circumstances. Chapter 6, Names and Stories. After a long pause, Barron set his phone aside, turning slightly to face Thomas. He asked in a soft voice, "What's your name?" Thomas was taken aback by the question. In all his years of struggling, no one had ever bothered to ask his name. They saw the shabby clothes, the scraggly beard, but they never saw him as a person. He was just the beggar, the homeless man. But Barron wasn't like the others. He wasn't looking at him with pity. There was no judgment in his eyes, only curiosity. "Thomas," he muttered, his voice low as he struggled to believe that Barron was truly interested in knowing his name. He had grown so used to being ignored that this simple question almost brought tears to his eyes. Barron smiled, a small but genuine smile, and said, "I'm Barron." The way he said it was simple, without the arrogance or distance Thomas had expected. It felt real. Barron wasn't some privileged kid looking down at him from above. He was just a person, speaking to another person. Barron then sat down beside Thomas, his posture relaxed, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Thomas didn't feel the need to shrink into himself. Barron sat next to him, not above him, and that made all the difference. "Tell me, Thomas," Barron asked quietly, "how long has it been like this? What happened?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably, but the kindness in Barron's eyes made him feel as though it was okay to speak. He had nothing to hide, after all. So he told Barron everything, the storm that had come out of nowhere, the boat that had been destroyed, and how, after that, everything had fallen apart. He told him about his failed attempts to rebuild, about the nights he spent alone, the feeling of helplessness that seemed to engulf him at every turn. Barron listened intently, nodding at the appropriate moments, and never once looked away or grew impatient. Thomas felt heard for the first time in a long while. As the conversation continued, Thomas opened up more. He shared his frustration about the world, the systems that had failed him, and his struggle to find a way out of his predicament. He spoke about the isolation he felt, the constant worry about where he would sleep at night or where his next meal would come from. Barron never interrupted, never judged. He simply listened. And as he did, Thomas could feel a shift inside him, a warmth, a flicker of hope that had long since been extinguished. It was strange to feel this way in the presence of a young man who had everything, and yet, here he was, offering something far more valuable than money, understanding. After a long silence, Barron asked about Thomas's family. It was a question Thomas hadn't expected, but it made him pause. "My wife passed away a few years ago," Thomas said, his voice breaking slightly. "And my kids. I haven't heard from them in a long time. They have their own lives now. I don't blame them. It's just..." He trailed off, the weight of the years of solitude heavy on his shoulders. Barron sat in silence, allowing Thomas to collect his thoughts. There was no rush, no awkward silence, just a quiet companionship that made the pain a little easier to bear. After hearing Thomas's story, Barron remained silent for a while, his gaze focused on the horizon as if deep in thought. Thomas wasn't sure whether Barron was considering his words or simply lost in his own mind, but the quiet stretched on, giving Thomas a chance to reflect on the unexpected turn of events. Then, with a soft motion, Barron reached into his pocket and pulled out a bill. Thomas, tired and skeptical from months of disappointment, thought it was probably just a few loose dollars. Another small token that wouldn't even be enough to get him a decent meal, but at least it was something. But as Barron unfolded the bill, Thomas's eyes widened in disbelief. It wasn't a few dollars, it was a crisp, new $100 bill. Thomas froze, staring at it in shock. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The amount was far beyond anything he could have imagined. Barron extended the bill to him, saying, "This should cover more than just coffee, Thomas. It should help you get a decent meal and maybe a place to sleep for the night." Thomas, still processing the gesture, stammered, his emotions mixed between gratitude and suspicion. "Are you serious? This is too much," he said, unable to fully grasp the kindness being extended to him. Barron simply nodded, his expression calm. "But earnest. It's not too much. It's just what you need right now." As Thomas opened his mouth to express his gratitude, Barron cut in gently, "But listen. This isn't just about the money. I want you to promise me something." Thomas, still stunned by the unexpected generosity, asked, "What's that?" Barron looked Thomas directly in the eye, his voice steady and firm. "If I help you today, you've got to help yourself tomorrow. I want you to take responsibility and make something of the opportunity. It's not just about handing you cash, it's about giving you a chance." Thomas felt the weight of Barron's words settle in his chest. The sincerity and the genuine desire to help pierced deeper than he had expected. There was no condescension, no expectation of anything in return other than his own effort. For a moment, Thomas couldn't find the words. He simply nodded, his throat tight with emotion, the promise forming silently on his lips. Barron stood up from the bench, his demeanor calm and unassuming despite the curious eyes of the people around them. He wasn't acting like he had just done something grand or extraordinary, there was no hint of self-satisfaction, just a quiet sense of doing what needed to be done. He pulled out a pen and a small piece of paper from his jacket pocket, quickly scribbling something down. Thomas watched, still processing everything, as Barron tore off the small sheet and handed it to him. "This is the address of a local community support center. I've already contacted them, they'll help you. You don't need to worry about anything." Thomas's hands trembled as he took the paper, the faintest flicker of hope igniting within him. He unfolded the small sheet of paper, and as he read the address, something inside him shifted. It wasn't just the promise of food or shelter, it was the possibility of a fresh start. Barron's voice broke the silence, his tone serious yet filled with encouragement. "This isn't just a handout, Thomas. This is an opportunity. They won't just give you a place to sleep for the night, they'll help you start over, if you want it." Thomas's heart swelled with a mix of disbelief and hope. It felt like a dream, one he hadn't dared to dream in years. Barron wasn't offering mere charity. He was offering a path forward. As Thomas's hands shook, he looked at Barron and asked, "Why? Why do you care? You don't even know me." Barron smiled, his expression gentle but knowing. "Because everyone has a story, Thomas. Yours just hasn't been told yet." He paused, allowing his words to settle between them. "Small actions can lead to something bigger. I believe that. Helping you today might just help you change the direction of your life." Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat, the weight of Barron's words sinking in deeper than he had anticipated. Barron wasn't doing this for recognition or reward. He wasn't trying to make himself feel good by offering charity. He was simply doing what he could because it was the right thing to do. "If I'm in a position to do something good," Barron continued, his voice unwavering, "why wouldn't I? Honestly, if you have the ability to make a difference, no matter how small, you should take that chance. There's no reason not to." Barron leaned in slightly, his gaze unwavering. "I don't expect anything from you, Thomas. But what I do believe is that small actions can lead to something bigger. All I'm asking is that you show up. Go to that center. Use the resources there. Take it seriously. If you do that, you'll change your life." Thomas's heart raced as he listened to Barron's words, his skepticism beginning to wane. It wasn't just about the money or the address on the paper. It was about something far deeper, a belief in the potential for change and the power of kindness. As Barron turned to leave, Thomas's mind was awash with conflicting emotions. He had spent so many years wondering if anyone in the world truly cared. And now, here was a young man, seemingly with everything, offering him not just help, but hope. It was more than he had ever expected. More than he had ever thought he deserved. And yet, it was exactly what he needed. Thomas stood frozen for a moment, staring at the piece of paper Barron had given him, the address of the Community Support Center. His mind was clouded with doubt, fear, and the weight of failure. He had heard of similar places before, places that promised help but often fell short. Was this another empty promise? Could he really change his life? The question gnawed at him, eating away at the resolve he had tried so hard to build. As he held the piece of paper, Barron noticed the hesitation in Thomas's eyes. Without missing a beat, Barron stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. His voice was calm, reassuring, yet firm. "Everyone screws up, Thomas," he said quietly, "but giving up, that's the only way you lose." Thomas looked up, meeting Barron's gaze. There was no pity in his eyes, no judgment. Just an unwavering belief in the possibility of change. Those words sank into Thomas like a lifeline. For the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. Barron wasn't asking for anything in return, he was simply offering the chance to try. "All right," Thomas said finally, his voice steady despite the uncertainty inside him. "I'll go. I'll show up." Barron's face broke into a smile, and he nodded. "That's all I wanted to hear." Before leaving, Barron turned to face the crowd around them, speaking louder now as if he wanted everyone to hear. "You've got more strength in you than you realize, Thomas. Don't forget that." Thomas watched him walk away, the weight of the promise on his shoulders, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. He had made the decision to try, to take the first step, no matter how small it seemed. The next morning, Thomas stood outside the address Barron had given him. The building was modest, with a small sign that read, "Port Blossom Community Support Center." The windows were unassuming, the walls simple, but there was something inviting about it. A place of hope, perhaps, a place where people could go when life had turned its back on them. He stood there for several minutes, unsure whether he should go in or turn back. The doubts crept in again. What if this was just another dead end? What if he didn't belong here? He thought about walking away, but something inside him held him in place. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. A cheerful receptionist greeted him immediately. "Hello, Thomas. We've been expecting you." Her warm tone was a stark contrast to the cold uncertainty Thomas felt. "Please, come right in." Thomas hesitated for a moment before following her down a narrow hallway to a small office. There, he was introduced to a social worker named Mary. She was kind and empathetic, listening intently as Thomas shared his story. When he was finished, she smiled gently and began to outline a plan to help him, finding work, providing counseling, and connecting him with others in the community. For the first time in a long while, Thomas felt like someone believed in him. Later that day, a local resident had filmed the moment Barron had helped Thomas on the street and posted it on social media. What had started as a simple act of kindness quickly went viral, attracting the attention of local media and people across the internet. The video spread like wildfire. Within hours, the community had shared the footage, and the story of Barron's act of generosity became a topic of conversation for many. Some expressed admiration for Barron's selflessness, praising him for taking the time to help someone in need. Others, however, questioned his motives. Was it a publicity stunt? A way to gain favor with the public? Despite the mixed reactions, the video captured something raw and powerful that resonated with people. For many, it was a reminder of the potential for kindness in a world that often seemed indifferent. Barron's simple act of reaching out had sparked a ripple effect, inspiring others to reconsider their own actions and attitudes toward helping others. As the weeks passed, Thomas threw himself into the programs at the support center. He attended job search workshops, participated in therapy sessions, and began to reconnect with the community. Slowly, but surely, he started to feel the weight of his past lift. The despair that had once consumed him began to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of hope. The center provided him with the tools and support he needed, but it was the people, staff and other individuals in the same situation, that gave him the strength to keep going. He had been surrounded by isolation for so long that the warmth of the center felt foreign at first. But as he shared his story, he found that others had similar struggles, and together, they began to believe in the possibility of a better life. Thomas's story also inspired many others at the center. His determination to turn his life around served as a beacon of hope for people who had lost faith in themselves. Conversations about change and hope flourished, and soon, the center was buzzing with a renewed energy. People were showing up, believing in themselves again, and trusting that they could change their lives. As the video continued to spread and people's opinions about Barron's actions were being discussed in public forums, he kept a low profile. Barron never sought attention for his actions, and despite the public recognition, he chose to stay out of the spotlight. Instead of using the media frenzy to his advantage, Barron quietly contacted the Port Blossom Community Support Center. He made a generous anonymous donation to help fund their programs, ensuring that the center could continue to assist people like Thomas. Barron didn't want his name attached to the donation. For him, it wasn't about basking in praise or seeking recognition. It was about helping people in need without any fanfare. The center's administrators were deeply grateful for the unexpected support. The funds allowed them to expand their services and reach more people who needed help. Barron's donation had a profound impact on the center, allowing them to offer even more resources, from job training to mental health support, and gave Thomas and others the chance to rebuild their lives. The people at the center never knew the identity of the donor, but they all felt the impact of his generosity. For them, it was enough to know that someone cared enough to give without expecting anything in return. Barron's quiet support had made a lasting difference in their community. Barron's act of kindness had sparked a wave of goodwill throughout the Port Blossom community. The story of his unexpected generosity touched the hearts of many and quickly spread across social media, turning into a movement that people started calling the #KindnessChallenge. What began with one man helping another became an invitation for everyone to reflect on how their own small acts of kindness could make a difference. Locals, inspired by Barron's example, began to help each other in ways they hadn't before. Neighbors who had once barely exchanged a word now stopped to check in on one another, offering support in any way they could. People began to donate to the community support center, understanding the importance of giving back to the very place that had helped Thomas. The act of generosity that started with Barron had spread like wildfire, creating a sense of unity and shared purpose that had been lacking for years. The community, which had once seemed fractured and distant, began to heal. People who were struggling were no longer facing their battles alone. There was a new sense of solidarity in the air, as if everyone had found a renewed sense of hope. The small acts of kindness were like ripples in the water, gradually reaching farther and farther, affecting more lives than anyone could have imagined. One afternoon, while Thomas was attending a community gathering at the support center, a woman in her late 60s approached him hesitantly. She paused in front of him, looking at him with a mixture of uncertainty and recognition. "Thomas?" she asked softly, her voice tentative. Thomas's heart skipped a beat as he looked up at her. There was something familiar about her face, but it took a moment for him to place it. She smiled gently, and then it clicked. She was his late wife's sister, someone he hadn't seen in years, not since his wife's passing. They had lost contact shortly after her death, and the years had created a painful distance between them. "I saw your story online," she continued, her eyes filled with emotion. "I was so moved. I should have reached out sooner. I'm so sorry I didn't." Tears welled up in Thomas's eyes as he realized what was happening. This was his family, the very person he had once shared so many memories with, and now she was here, reconnecting with him after all this time. The reunion was emotional, filled with a mix of sadness and joy, but above all, it was a source of tremendous encouragement for Thomas on his road to recovery. "I never thought I'd see you again," Thomas whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been so lost for so long." She gently placed a hand on his, her voice soft but filled with warmth. "You're not lost anymore. We're family, and we've got a second chance to rebuild what we had." The emotional reunion gave Thomas a new sense of strength. It was another turning point in his recovery, another reminder that even after the darkest times, there was always room for hope and healing. A few months later, Thomas's life had changed in ways he never thought possible. He had found a stable job, rented a small apartment, and slowly started to regain his confidence. He no longer felt like an invisible man, like someone the world had forgotten. His life was beginning to come together, piece by piece, and it felt like a miracle. Every week, Thomas returned to the community support center, not as a recipient of help but as someone who could offer support to others. He shared his story with anyone who would listen, encouraging others who were struggling to keep going. He knew what it felt like to be lost, but he also knew what it felt like to find hope again. Thomas had learned that the most valuable thing he could give to others wasn't money or material things, it was his own story. It was proof that, no matter how far down someone fell, they could always rise again. Barron's kindness had given him that chance, and now it was his turn to pay it forward. No longer did Thomas feel like he was abandoned by the world. He understood now that kindness and love could change lives, and he was living proof of it. He carried that message with him every day, determined to help others find the hope he had found. The story of Barron's act of kindness, and the subsequent transformation in Thomas's life, continued to be talked about in Port Blossom. It became a symbol of the power of compassion, a reminder that even the smallest actions could have far-reaching effects. The community often recounted the story of how Barron's generosity had ignited a wave of change, not just in Thomas's life, but in the lives of many others. Although Barron remained out of the public eye, refusing to take credit for the ripple effect his actions had caused, the people of Port Blossom never forgot his kindness. To them, Barron's quiet generosity was more powerful than any public display of charity. It wasn't about recognition, it was about helping a fellow human being when they needed it the most. Thomas, on the other hand, continued his new life with a sense of purpose and gratitude. He had been given a second chance, and he wasn't going to squander it. He had learned that even in the darkest times, there was always hope, and that one small act of kindness could change everything. The story ended with a simple but profound message: compassion has the power to transform lives. No matter how small the action, it can create ripples that extend far beyond what we can see, making the world a better place, one person at a time. For Thomas, Barron had given him hope when he had none left, and for that, he would be forever grateful. And there you have it, the tale that began with a single act of kindness, unraveling into something much greater than anyone could have imagined. The power of compassion, the ripple effects of a simple gesture, and the transformations that can arise from even the smallest actions, it's a message that resonates deeply. If this story moved you, if it made you think, or even if it simply inspired you to reflect on your own life, then Heartfelt Tales has done its job. But we need your voice too. Share your thoughts in the comments below, let us know how this story impacted you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button to keep these powerful stories coming your way. Until next time, remember that every heart holds a tale. What's yours?